Seraphina, and tonight I'd like to share an extremely personal story with you. It's told through the lens of the experience that a family member of mine went through not so long ago. Their story is one of inner conflict, mistakes, and eventually finding a way to forgive themselves. Let's settle in, relax, and take this time together to reflect on how we all carry the weight of our choices and how we can find peace through reflection and understanding. It begins with my cousin Mark. Mark had always lived carefully. He had strong values, a deep sense of right and wrong, and a moral compass that guided him through his decisions. But life isn't always so simple. Sometimes, even the best intentioned people can make choices that change everything. One night, Mark made a mistake during a particularly stressful time in his life. It wasn't a small mistake either. It was something that, in an instant, caused harm to someone else, and it left him with a deep sense of guilt. I remember when he told me about it. His voice was heavy, and his eyes were dark with worry. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had done something unforgivable. Mark found himself trapped in the web of his own mind. After the incident, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. His guilt consumed him. He started withdrawing from friends and family, isolating himself from the people who cared about him. He would spend hours alone in his apartment, pacing, his thoughts spinning in endless circles. What had he done? Why did he do it? Could he ever be forgiven? Mark's mind became a prison, and the guilt he felt weighed on him like a physical burden. He told me that whenever he closed his eyes, he would repeatedly see the consequences of his actions playing out in his mind. He would hear the voices of those he had wronged, feel the pain he had caused, and the shame that followed him everywhere. It was as though he was punishing himself long after the incident had passed. For months, Mark lived in a state of inner torment. No matter how much time passed, the guilt didn't fade. He was haunted by the thought that he had crossed a moral line, and he couldn't forgive himself. Mark tried to rationalize his crime, but is ultimately crushed by the weight of his own conscience. Mark was in a constant battle with himself. He couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of what he should have done differently, how he could have prevented what happened. His guilt took on a life of its own, and he began to feel as though he deserved to suffer. In his mind, there was no redemption for what he had done. I could see how much he was struggling. One evening, we sat together in the quiet of his living room, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner. The air felt heavy with the weight of everything he had been carrying. Mark finally opened up to me about the full extent of his guilt. His voice cracked as he spoke, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "I don't know how to move on from this," he said. "I feel like I don't deserve to be happy anymore." It was heartbreaking to hear him talk like that, to see someone who had always been so strong and sure of himself now so broken. He told me that he had tried to make amends, to apologize to those he had hurt, but it didn't feel like enough. The guilt clung to him no matter what he did, making it impossible to move forward. But as we talked, something began to shift. I reminded Mark that while what he had done couldn't be undone, it didn't mean he was beyond redemption. I told him that the path to healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting responsibility, making things right where he could, and learning to forgive himself. He had already taken steps toward making amends, but the hardest part, the part he had been avoiding, was forgiving himself. Mark's eventual realization that he must face the consequences of his actions in order to find peace. Mark needed to confront his guilt head-on, rather than running from it. It wasn't enough to punish himself in his mind. He needed to take active steps toward healing. The turning point came when Mark decided to seek help. He began talking to a therapist, someone who could help him work through his guilt and understand the emotions he had been suppressing for so long. It wasn't an easy process. There were days when the weight of what he had done seemed too much to bear, but little by little, he started to unravel the tangled web of guilt that had trapped him. Mark learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what had happened or minimizing the harm he had caused. It meant acknowledging his mistakes, accepting that he had done wrong, but also recognizing that he was still capable of growth and change. As the months passed, Mark began to heal. The guilt he had carried for so long began to lighten, though it never fully disappeared. He learned to live with it, not as a constant source of pain, but as a reminder of the lessons he had learned. He found ways to make amends, not just to those he had hurt, but to himself as well. Mark began volunteering in his community, giving his time to help those in need. It was his way of paying it forward, of turning his guilt into something positive. He told me once that helping others made him feel like he was slowly balancing the scales, that each act of kindness was a small step toward redemption. In the end, Mark's journey was one of self-forgiveness and growth. He realized that while he couldn't change the past, he could choose how to move forward. The guilt that had once consumed him became a part of his story, but it no longer defined him. Only through the eventual acceptance of his punishment and search for redemption, Mark found peace by taking responsibility for his actions and making a conscious choice to live differently. His story reminds me so much of the themes in Crime and Punishment. It's about the heavy weight of guilt, the struggle to come to terms with one's mistakes, and the possibility of redemption through reflection and responsibility. Mark's journey wasn't easy, and there were many moments when he doubted whether he deserved forgiveness. But in the end, he found a way to forgive himself and to move forward with a new sense of purpose. Take a deep breath in and let it out. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight and for listening to Mark's story. I hope it brought you a sense of peace and reflection, and maybe even some inspiration if you've ever struggled with guilt yourself. Remember, we are all capable of change, and while the path to redemption can be difficult, it is always within reach. Until next time, sweet dreams, lovely friend.